In the mid-1990s, commercial aviation still carried an air of quiet confidence. Airports were busy but unfortified, built around the assumption that speed and convenience mattered more than layered security. Metal detectors stood at checkpoints, but procedures were inconsistent and cockpit doors were thin, often unlocked during routine flight. For millions of passengers, flying across the Atlantic was less an act of trust and more an act of habit. The Cold War had ended. The world, at least in the West, felt comparatively stable. Terrorism existed, but it was often perceived as regional, fragmented, contained. It was within this atmosphere of routine that a transatlantic flight prepared for departure on a winter morning. The aircraft itself was unremarkable, wide-bodied, efficient, designed for long-haul crossings between North Africa and Europe. The passengers boarding that day carried the usual assortment of intentions: business meetings, family reunions, holidays postponed, and finally realized. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with rehearsed calm, guiding luggage into overhead bins, offering polite reassurance to anxious travelers. Nothing in the terminal suggested that this flight would become a case study in modern aviation vulnerability. Yet beyond the terminal glass, the geopolitical climate was shifting in ways most civilians rarely tracked. Militant networks were evolving in North Africa, shaped by regional conflicts and hardened by ideological conviction. Armed groups were experimenting with tactics that blurred the line between symbolic violence and strategic messaging. Aviation, with its international visibility and psychological weight, presented an opportunity. An aircraft was not merely transportation. It was a stage suspended in the sky, carrying multiple nationalities and commanding global attention. The men who boarded that morning did so quietly. Their preparation had not been theatrical. There were no dramatic rehearsals or last-minute adjustments. Instead, there was discipline and patience, shaped by a belief that the world was inattentive. They understood the weaknesses of the system they were about to exploit: minimal identity verification, inconsistent baggage screening, cockpit access that depended largely on professional courtesy rather than reinforced barriers. Their plan did not rely on chaos. It relied on predictability. The flight departed smoothly. Engines roared against the runway, and then softened into a steady hum as the aircraft leveled over the Mediterranean. Passengers settled into the rhythms of long-haul travel, headphones pressed against ears, paperback novels opened, plastic cups filled with juice and coffee. The cabin lights dimmed. Outside the windows, the sky stretched in pale winter gradients. The hijacking did not begin with a scream. It began with movement, measured and coordinated. The men rose from their seats at a calculated moment, navigating the narrow aisle with deliberate purpose. Weapons were produced, not brandished wildly, but displayed with enough clarity to remove doubt. The shift in atmosphere was immediate yet contained. Confusion spread first, then comprehension. A flight attendant froze mid-step. A passenger halfway through a sentence fell silent. Within minutes, the cockpit was breached. The pilots, trained primarily for mechanical failure rather than human aggression, faced a scenario that airline manuals of the era treated as remote. Hijackings in previous decades had often followed a grim logic: diversion to another airport, negotiation, eventual release. The unspoken assumption was that hijackers wanted leverage, not annihilation. That assumption would quietly shape the decisions made in the hours ahead. On the ground, air traffic controllers registered the deviation. Radio transmissions shifted in tone, from routine coordination to coded alerts. Government ministries were notified. Intelligence agencies began assembling fragments of information, attempting to identify the group responsible and their possible demands. The aircraft, now redirected, became a moving focal point for multiple governments, each balancing domestic pressure against diplomatic calculation. Inside the cabin, time elongated. Fear settled unevenly among passengers. Some wept, others withdrew into silence. The hijackers maintained control with rigid discipline, issuing instructions, restricting movement, reinforcing their authority through proximity rather than indiscriminate violence. Their objective extended beyond immediate ransom or escape. They sought visibility, a statement that would reverberate beyond the aircraft's fuselage. As the plane landed at a foreign airport under tense coordination, a second phase began. Negotiations unfolded through intermediaries. Officials weighed the risks of compliance against the risks of escalation. Special forces units were placed on standby, studying the aircraft layout, calculating angles of entry, rehearsing contingencies. Media coverage intensified, transforming the standoff into an international spectacle. Yet beneath the headlines, analysts quietly noted the operational sophistication displayed, the timing, the planning, the exploitation of systemic complacency. Hour by hour, the hijacking exposed vulnerabilities that had long been tolerated. Cockpit access proved dangerously easy. Passenger screening had failed to intercept weapons. Communication protocols between airlines and governments were fragmented, slowed by jurisdictional ambiguity. None of these weaknesses were new. What was new was the realization that they could be orchestrated into something far more strategic than a diversionary crisis. For the passengers, the ordeal blurred into cycles of uncertainty. Hunger, exhaustion, and anxiety mingled in the pressurized air. Small acts of human resilience emerged: shared water, whispered reassurances, steady eye contact meant to ground one another in normalcy. The aircraft became a confined world governed by shifting rules, where every announcement carried disproportionate weight. When the crisis ultimately resolved, through force, negotiation, or a combination carefully managed by authorities, the immediate relief overshadowed deeper analysis. Survivors disembarked into floodlights and waiting ambulances. Governments declared success in preventing greater catastrophe. Aviation officials promised reviews and adjustments. Public attention, intense for days, gradually drifted toward the next headline. But within intelligence circles and security briefings, the incident lingered. Analysts documented the hijackers' methods, their ideological affiliations, their willingness to consider the aircraft itself as a potential weapon rather than merely a bargaining chip. The idea was not yet fully formed, but it was present, an unsettling shift from hostage-taking towards something more terminal. In retrospect, the flight occupies an uneasy position in history. It was neither the first hijacking nor the deadliest of its era. Yet it revealed a pattern that would only later be understood in full. It demonstrated how routine systems could be turned inward, how the architecture of global mobility could be manipulated with relatively simple tools and disciplined intent. At the time, it felt like a crisis contained. Procedures were adjusted incrementally. Security tightened in measured steps. The broader public, reassured by official statements, returned to airports with the same quiet trust that had defined the decade. The aircraft itself was repaired or retired, folded back into the machinery of commerce. What remained was less visible, a blueprint sketched in motion, tested in real time, observed by those who believed the lesson incomplete. The hijacking did not transform the world overnight. It did something subtler. It demonstrated that the sky was no longer insulated from the ideological battles unfolding on the ground. And in that recognition, muted, procedural, largely absorbed into bureaucratic reports, lay a warning that history would revisit with far greater consequence. The hours following the initial hijacking transformed the incident from a contained event into a slowly unfolding geopolitical puzzle. Once the aircraft had been commandeered, the immediate focus shifted from a confined space of the cabin to the vast, interconnected networks of authority that govern international airspace, diplomacy, and intelligence. Air traffic control centers transmitted coded alerts across continents, each message stripped of emotion, but heavy with implication. In offices far from the runway, analysts began to assemble the fragments of a story: passenger lists, aircraft schematics, manifest details, and preliminary reports from embassy contacts. The standoff had grown beyond a singular, visible crisis into a complex web of institutional response, each node attempting to balance urgency with procedure. The hijackers' presence on the aircraft was carefully measured, almost methodical. They did not rely on chaos or theatrics to assert authority. Every instruction, every movement was designed to maintain control, to communicate competence, and to signal seriousness without tipping into overt violence prematurely. Their stated demands, when transmitted through intermediaries, were precise yet ideologically charged, reflecting a worldview that framed the act as both statement and leverage. Officials struggled to reconcile the immediacy of the threat with its underlying motivations. Each negotiation became a test of comprehension, patience, and the capacity to anticipate reasoning that was simultaneously rational within its own framework and alien to conventional diplomacy. The media, sensing the public appetite for information, began to report in real time. Broadcasts highlighted the sequence of events, but the narrative was necessarily fragmented. Anchors described the standoff with caution, avoiding speculation, yet their words carried an undertone of tension. For those observing from afar, the hijacking became a lens through which larger anxieties were refracted. The vulnerability of global aviation, the persistence of international extremism, and the opacity of decision-making behind the scenes. Public perception oscillated between fear and detachment, a rhythm mirrored in the analytic reports being drafted in secure offices where every detail, every misstep or hesitation was recorded for posterity. Inside the aircraft, passengers endured a different calculus of time. Each moment was drawn out by waiting, by the uncertainty of official response and the opacity of the hijackers' intentions. The human mind, confronted with prolonged stasis under threat, cycles through heightened alertness and a numbing inertia. Small acts of solidarity emerged among travelers, shared water, quiet reassurances, and deliberate efforts to maintain composure. Yet beneath these gestures lingered anxiety, an awareness that their fates were tied not only to the decisions of those around them, but to the procedural machinery that now dominated the crisis. The institutional response was inevitably fragmented. Governments had to coordinate across multiple layers: domestic security, foreign affairs, military readiness, and intelligence gathering. Each agency operated within its own protocols, which often lacked seamless integration with counterparts abroad. Analysts examined the hijackers' patterns, searching for insight into their operational logic, training, and affiliations. They compared past incidents, noted deviations, and attempted to predict next steps. Yet the available data was incomplete. Ambiguity became the constant companion of every decision-maker, forcing choices that were provisional, often conservative, and sometimes paradoxically cautious in the face of a threat that demanded decisiveness. Warnings had existed in prior years, signals in intelligence briefings, patterns of regional extremism, and prior smaller-scale hijackings. Yet these signals had not crystallized into systemic change. Procedural inertia, competing priorities, and a reliance on the assumption that aviation infrastructure was secure created blind spots that the hijackers now exploited. Decision-makers recognized these gaps even as they navigated the immediate crisis, highlighting the dissonance between knowledge and actionable reform. The tension was subtle but profound. It existed not in the fireworks of violent escalation, but in the quiet realization that existing structures were insufficient to prevent recurrence. Negotiations progressed incrementally. Intermediaries relayed information, often filtered, constrained by protocol, and cautious of misinterpretation. Each communication contained multiple layers of subtext: the literal demands of the hijackers, the implicit threat contained in delay, and the psychological dance of asserting control while signaling potential restraint. Officials had to calibrate responses to maintain credibility without inadvertently encouraging further aggression. Every misstep, real or perceived, risked cascading consequences. This procedural tension, largely invisible to the public, shaped the trajectory of the standoff in ways that would only be understood retrospectively. The ideological framework of the hijackers framed their actions as a continuation of a broader campaign. Their operational discipline was entwined with an intellectual commitment to a cause that extended beyond immediate financial or territorial gain. Analysts working to map this context sought to trace connections between disparate cells, prior incidents, and emerging networks. Patterns emerged, revealing a slow but deliberate evolution in methods, targets, and timing. These insights, while recognized internally, were often filtered through layers of bureaucracy, limiting the speed at which corrective action could be taken. The procedural rhythm of governments, deliberate, codified, risk-averse, contrasted sharply with the agility displayed by the perpetrators. Throughout the standoff, time became elastic. Each hour expanded to reveal new logistical and psychological considerations. Fuel levels, potential diversion airports, medical contingencies, and media scrutiny intersected with the human dimensions of stress, fear, and calculation. Intelligence agencies tracked communications, monitored potential accomplices, and evaluated regional stability factors. Every action taken or deferred was simultaneously reactive and predictive, reflecting an understanding that immediate success was inseparable from the anticipation of long-term implications. The unfolding incident became a live exercise in strategic patience, where the appearance of control often masked profound uncertainty. As the immediate threat began to resolve, attention shifted toward assessment and consequence. Analysts pieced together the hijackers' methodology, evaluating how procedural gaps had been exploited. Governments reviewed response protocols, identifying both successes and lapses. The public, largely shielded from operational detail, absorbed the outcome as closure of a contained crisis. Yet in the quiet spaces of intelligence offices, the seeds of systemic concern were being cataloged. The patterns of operational discipline, the ideological clarity, and the exploitation of institutional blind spots offered a template for future consideration, one that would only fully manifest years later. By the time the aircraft returned to regular service, the event had left an indelible mark on those involved in its oversight. Lessons were formally documented, security procedures incrementally updated, and warnings circulated to policymakers. Yet the broader institutional and cultural changes required to prevent recurrence were slow to materialize. In the meantime, the psychological imprint of the standoff endured, a reminder that human systems, no matter how structured, remain vulnerable to ingenuity applied with patience and intent. In retrospect, the standoff illustrates the subtle mechanics of crisis management in a globalized world. It was not a sequence defined by spectacle, but by procedural rigor, cautious negotiation, and analytical observation. The hijackers' ideology, operational competence, and timing converge with institutional inertia to create a situation that was contained, yet revealing. Every decision, every delay, every miscommunication contributed to a broader understanding of vulnerability that would resonate in subsequent years. The incident, once resolved, was cataloged not as a dramatic historical milestone, but as a quiet warning embedded within the evolving architecture of global aviation security. By grounding the analysis in context, the chapter allows reflection on the interplay between human behavior, procedural rigidity, and emerging threats. It situates the hijacking within a continuum rather than an anomaly, emphasizing the latent consequences of oversight, the significance of ideological evolution, and the way systems can be quietly manipulated without immediate spectacle. As officials filed reports and debriefings, and as passengers slowly resumed the rhythms of ordinary life, the incident persisted in memory, not as headline, but as a measured case study of intelligence, patience, and the subtle pressures that define modern security landscapes. The crisis, by the time it had resolved, left behind a quiet aftermath that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the hours it had consumed. Passengers disembarked with relief, their faces marked by exhaustion, lingering fear, and the residual tension of a confined world governed by uncertainty. Flight crews filed reports and underwent debriefings, translating their lived experience into procedural language. Governments, meanwhile, attempted to reconcile the immediacy of the threat with broader institutional lessons. For most observers, the event became a contained incident, an anomaly that had been managed, documented, and largely absorbed into the rhythms of daily life. Yet beneath this apparent closure, the implications began to ripple outward, subtle and persistent, touching aspects of security, intelligence, and operational planning that few, at the time, fully appreciated. Investigations conducted in the aftermath were meticulous. Every movement aboard the aircraft, every decision by the hijackers, every procedural response was cataloged and analyzed. Authorities examined the logistical experimentation embedded within the operation, timing of movements, coordination among multiple actors, use of psychological leverage over passengers and crew, and exploitation of systemic weaknesses. Even minor details, a choice of cabin section, the concealment of weapons, or the pacing of instructions, were documented with precision. Analysts recognized that the hijackers' methods demonstrated not only discipline but strategic foresight, a recognition that aviation systems could be influenced through both technical knowledge and calculated human behavior. At the same time, the broader networks from which the perpetrators emerged were quietly under scrutiny. Intelligence agencies traced connections between local cells and transnational organizations, piecing together a framework that revealed patterns of communication, resource acquisition, and operational training. The act in isolation was unsettling. Viewed within this network context, it became an early indicator of a more sophisticated approach to asymmetric tactics, an approach that would, in later years, manifest in far deadlier forms. Analysts noted that the operation was not a spontaneous eruption of violence, but a deliberate exercise in testing vulnerabilities and refining methods. Documentation from these investigations often highlighted the procedural gaps that had been exploited. Aviation vulnerabilities, weak cockpit access, inconsistent baggage screening, and fragmented interagency communication were cataloged alongside recommendations for reform. Yet the implementation of these lessons was uneven. Recommendations circulated within bureaucratic channels, often diluted by competing priorities, limited resources, and institutional inertia. In many cases, the procedural reforms enacted addressed immediate symptoms without fully grappling with underlying systemic weaknesses. The discrepancy between recognition and implementation underscored a recurring theme. Knowledge alone did not guarantee prevention. In examining the broader implications, the narrative reveals the slow maturation of extremist networks. The methods observed during the hijacking, once analyzed in detail, informed future operational planning within these groups. Patterns of target selection, timing, coordination, and psychological pressure were codified internally, creating a tacit blueprint for future attacks. For authorities, the challenge was in recognizing these patterns in real time and translating insight into preventive action. The tension between insight and response, the lag inherent in institutional adaptation, became a defining element in the story of early 21st century aviation security. The human dimension remained central. Survivors of the incident carried an invisible imprint of fear, vigilance, and recalibration. Crew members reflected on decision-making under duress, weighing the limits of protocol against instinct and improvisation. Analysts, often removed from the visceral experience, interpreted data points, reports, and interviews to create a coherent account of the incident. The intersection of these perspectives created a layered understanding, one that considered both immediate outcomes and latent consequences. By contextualizing the event within psychological, operational, and systemic frameworks, the narrative moves beyond dramatization, instead offering measured insight into causality and pattern recognition. The media, meanwhile, documented the visible contours of resolution: passengers safe, hijackers apprehended or neutralized, flight resumed. Headlines emphasized containment and procedural success, often omitting the deeper structural lessons that investigators were uncovering. This divergence between public perception and analytical insight illustrates how complex events can be simplified in collective memory, while the intricate patterns that define long-term risk remain largely invisible. The incident's significance in this sense became a footnote in popular history, while quietly shaping professional discourse on security and intelligence. In retrospect, the hijacking exemplifies the iterative nature of threat evolution. Each operational choice, each procedural oversight, and each institutional response contributed to a subtle learning process for both perpetrators and authorities. The hijackers' experimentation was absorbed into tactical knowledge within extremist networks, informing approaches to timing, logistics, and psychological manipulation in future operations. Similarly, the incomplete implementation of security lessons highlighted vulnerabilities in bureaucratic and procedural structures, revealing that insight must be paired with sustained action to effect meaningful change. The chapter's reflective lens also considers temporality. What may appear as a contained episode at one moment can, over years, acquire amplified significance. The quiet observation of methodical exploitation becomes, in hindsight, a blueprint for future scenarios. Analysts and historians looking back see a chain of causality that contemporaries did not fully perceive. This temporal distance allows for a deeper appreciation of the interplay between planning, opportunity, and systemic response. The narrative thus situates the incident not as an isolated anomaly, but as a harbinger of evolving tactics that would challenge conventional assumptions about security and resilience. Operational nuance remains a focal point. The hijackers' decisions, calibrated for maximum control with